Afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are, and welcome to this month's NCORE Connect and Explore webinar. Our topic today is Understanding Weight Stigma, Impacts on Families and Youth. And in just a few minutes, we'll be getting to today's presentation, and after that, there will be a chance for Q&A, and then we'll close out with a few quick announcements. But first, I want to do some introductions. My name is Karen Hilliard from the NCORE Coordinating Center, and I'll be your facilitator for today. And now I would like to introduce today's speakers. We can advance the slide. There we go. So our first speaker for today is Rebecca Poole, a PhD, and she is a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences at the University of Connecticut. She is also the Deputy Director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health. Her research addresses weight stigma and discrimination across multiple societal settings, its impact on emotional well-being and health, and strategies to reduce weight stigma in healthcare and public policy. Our second speaker for today is Catherine Roncagno, who is an associate policy researcher at RAND Corporation in the Department of Behavioral and Policy Sciences. And her research is broadly focused on understanding and addressing the multi-level factors that influence health and well-being in vulnerable and marginalized populations. She completed her PhD in nutrition interventions at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University, and her dissertation focused on experiences of weight stigma from family members. Before we dive into those presentations from our two speakers today, I do want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, if you need technical assistance, you can let us know using the chat box. And if you're having trouble logging into the webinar, please email us at ncore@fhi360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. Also, if you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, you can write it using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Also, one other note, we will be tweeting today's webinar from the NCORE Twitter platform. And if you'd like to join the conversation there, you can use the hashtag ConnectExplore. And now it's always helpful to our speakers to know who is in the audience with us. So we have a couple of questions for all of you who have joined us today. The first question that we would like to ask, and these poll questions will come right up on the screen and you can answer them there. The first question is, what profession or sector do you identify with? And you can select all that apply. Are you a researcher, federal program manager, clinician, registered dietitian or nutritionist? Are you in public policy, a student? Is this just a general interest topic for you or something else? And then second question is what profession, let's see, sorry, just one question today. Sorry about that. Anyway, we've got one question about your profession or sector that you identify with. All right, so if you can go ahead and answer that, we'll give you just another moment more. Almost everybody has participated at this point. We'll give you a couple more seconds here. Again, you can select all that apply, and we'll go ahead and count down. Please put in your responses. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And let's go ahead and share those results with everyone. So as you can see, just to know who else is with you in this audience, we have a mix of researchers, folks from federal program management, a good number of clinicians. And again, there may be some overlap between these categories. We've also got some folks who are interested in public policy, who are students, or who are in some other categories here, and you can feel free to put those in the chat if you would like to comment on what brought you here and what your interests are. So thank you so much. We can move on now, and We are going to head right into our spotlight presentation for today. And again, today's presentation is Understanding Weight Stigma Impacts on Families and Youth. And our guest speakers today are Rachel Poole and Catherine Roncagno. And after hearing from each of our guest speakers, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. And at any point during the speakers' presentations, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to put in a question that will be answered during our Q&A period at the end. So now let me first give a quick introduction to the topic. So, as you know, INCOR's mission is to accelerate progress in reducing childhood obesity for all children with attention to high-risk populations and communities. And that is the reason that weight stigma is such a powerful area of interest for INCOR, and one that we wanted to spotlight in today's Connect and Explore webinar. Let me give you a definition of weight stigma. It is defined as discriminatory acts and ideologies targeting individuals because of their weight and size. And weight stigma is pervasive in our society. It affects both adults and children. And experiences of weight stigma can significantly influence a wide range of health outcomes, including all-cause mortality. And as you will see on the next slide from the journal articles highlighted here, there's also evidence that weight stigma targeted at children and adolescents can often negatively affect their parents and caregivers as well. Now, a number of national and international organizations have identified weight stigma and bias as a priority, including INCOR and including the American Academy of Pediatrics in a 2017 policy statement. The Obesity Action Coalition is one of several organizations working on the issue with its Stop Weight Bias campaign that aims to raise societal awareness and start an open conversation that can put an end to weight bias. Weight stigma is also a topic that NIH wants to understand better, and they have announced a Notice of Special Interest Funding, or also known as a NOSI, slated to become available in February and continue over the next several years. And the purpose of the NOSI is to support applications for funding of innovative research or career development training that explores the mechanisms and consequences of weight stigma, bias, and discrimination in both children and adults with overweight or obesity. And a secondary objective of this NOSI is to evaluate the effects of obesity-related interventions or policies that address weight bias and its consequences, such as stigma and discrimination in affected groups. And you'll see here the number of the NOSI. It's NOTHL 24032. That's on the right-hand side of the screen. And we encourage you to take a look at it and to share that with your professional network. In just a moment, we're going to hear from our first speaker then about the health consequences of weight stigma in youth and the role of parents. And I want to remind all of you again that we will have Q&A at the end, and you can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Rebecca Poole.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. For some reason, the slides I think are available to all of you, but they're not in front of me. They're not showing up on my screen. So I've pulled up a copy, and I'm hoping that this will all align perfectly. So, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's really a pleasure to be joining you, and I'll just be providing a brief summary of how weight stigma impacts health in youth and the role of parents in contributing to weight stigma. Next slide. So typically weight stigma is understood as social devaluation of people because of their body weight or body size. And for youth, weight stigma is most commonly experienced as teasing, bullying, or harassment, sometimes collectively referred to as weight-based victimization. And these experiences can take many forms, including verbal teasing, cyberbullying, physical aggression, or relational victimization. And they can come from multiple sources, not just from peers, but as I'll be talking about today, even from family members. Next slide. And youth who have higher weight are significantly more likely to be bullied because of their weight than peers with lower body weight. And typically we see the prevalence ranging from about 1/3 to as high as 1/2 of youth. And the risk of weight bullying increases as BMI increases. And we've seen that this pattern can persist regardless of factors like race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, or disability. And weight-based teasing is also reported by girls and boys across multiple racial and ethnic minority groups. So youth of diverse backgrounds are vulnerable to these experiences. Next slide. So how is weight stigma impacting the emotional and physical health of youth? Well, it's harmful in a number of ways. And in addition to emotional distress that youth experience because of weight stigma, it also impacts their eating behaviors, their physical activity, their body weight. And this evidence has been found in both community and treatment seeking samples of youth, and both when stigma is experienced by peers as well as family members. And I want to highlight that a number of studies in this literature control for variables like weight status, age, and timing of obesity onset. And that's important because it tells us that it's not weight status per se that's linked with these negative outcomes, but rather it's the experience of weight stigma that is directly contributing. So I'm going to briefly summarize some of these negative health consequences. Next slide. So first, youth who are teased or bullied about their weight are at higher risk for negative psychological consequences. And this includes higher levels of depressive symptoms, anxiety, low self-esteem, worse body image, and greater substance use. And unfortunately, data shows that adolescents who've experienced weight stigma in the last 6 months are more likely to engage in intentional self-harm and attempting suicide. That's after controlling for sociodemographic factors, BMI, and depressive symptoms. And sadly, in recent years, we have seen more reports in the media of teens who have died by suicide, in part because of the weight-based bullying that they've experienced. Next slide. Beyond psychological distress, we know that weight stigma contributes to poor physical health. And a finding that has emerged from longitudinal research is that experiencing weight stigma predicts increased weight gain over time. I can point you to a 2021 meta-analysis and systematic review of 25 studies in youth by Ma and colleagues who found evidence of a positive, concurrent, and bidirectional relationship between weight stigma and weight status. And I highlight this because there remains some perceptions in our society that stigma motivates people to lose weight or provides an incentive for weight loss, but the evidence indicates instead that stigma is predicting increased weight gain and reinforcing obesity. Next slide. So as an example, I've highlighted a prospective study here that I collaborated on with Diane Newmark Steiner at the University of Minnesota, who's the PI of a cohort study called Project EAT. And it has followed almost 2,000 adolescents for more than 15 years into their mid-30s. And at the baseline of this study, participants were about 15 years old. They were asked how often they were teased about their weight and whether the teasing came from peers, family members, or both. And what we found is that women who had been teased about weight in adolescence from either their family or peers had more than a 2 times increased odds of having obesity 15 years later as adults. For men, this same pattern emerged if they were teased about their weight from peers, but not family members. And these analyses did control for baseline weight status, sociodemographic characteristics. And so this suggests that weight teasing may have long-term implications for weight status. But the question is, why are we seeing this pattern? And why is weight stigma leading to weight gain? Next slide. So there are several mechanisms likely at play here, and one is physical activity. So youth who are stigmatized about their weight are more likely to avoid physical activity and skip things like gym class, often because those are settings where they feel vulnerable to being teased about their weight. And they also report lower levels of being physically active, less self-confidence in being physically active, and lower enjoyment in sports. Next slide. Another consequence of weight-based teasing is maladaptive eating behaviors. And youth who experience weight teasing are more likely to engage in binge eating and emotional overeating, more likely to increase food consumption, and more likely to engage in unhealthy dieting and weight control practices. We typically see that these eating behaviors are more frequent for youth who experience more frequent weight teasing. who experience multiple types of weight teasing, and if they have more distress from that weight teasing. And the earlier that the weight teasing starts, the more likely that they are to engage in binge eating in adulthood. So these unhealthy eating patterns can remain present through adolescence and persist into adulthood. Next slide. And one of the reasons why these links with maladaptive eating may be present is that youth may be coping with the emotional distress of weight stigma in ways that reinforce unhealthy eating behaviors. So, as an example, in a study that we did with adolescents who had been teased or bullied about their weight in the past year, we found that both boys and girls who reported emotional distress in response to weight based bullying said that they coped with this distress by turning to food, engaging in binge eating, and avoiding physical activity. So these kinds of coping responses can set the stage for unhealthy patterns that can become ingrained over time. Next slide. Now, another way that weight stigma can worsen health behaviors is when youth internalize weight bias. So when they apply weight-based stereotypes to themselves and engage in self-directed stigma. And we typically see higher levels of internalization in girls than boys. But for both girls and boys, internalizing weight stigma can have the same negative health consequences as the experience of weight stigma itself. So we see links with binge eating, maladaptive eating behaviors, low self-esteem, and psychological distress. And some studies are even showing that this internalized stigma is predicting these worse health outcomes more than the experience of stigma itself. Next slide. So this evidence collectively shows us the ways in which weight stigma can contribute to weight gain and obesity. The psychosocial distress of experiencing weight stigma can give way to both unhealthy coping strategies and internalization, both of which reinforce unhealthy eating behaviors and low physical activity, which can contribute to weight gain. And this ultimately creates a harmful cycle because we know that weight gain just makes kids more vulnerable to weight stigma. And so, in this sense, I think it's helpful to think about weight stigma as both a psychosocial contributor to higher weight and a psychosocial consequence of higher weight. Next slide. So, what role do parents play here? I think what's particularly concerning is research documenting that family members are sources of weight based teasing. And it's important to remember that parents are not immune to weight bias, and many do endorse some level of negative weight based stereotypes. I've highlighted a handful of our studies on this slide where we've asked adolescents and adults about who they have experienced weight stigma from in their lives. And family members are often one of the most common sources reported. And you can see here how high these percentages are for how many people report they've been stigmatized about their weight by parents or family members. The lowest is more than 1/3, and the highest is almost 3/4. Next slide. Now, weight teasing from family is typically more often reported by girls than boys and is present across different racial and ethnic groups of youth. We typically see that family weight teasing is more likely to occur when parents are concerned about their child's weight and if the mother is dieting to lose weight herself. But we do see weight teasing by both mothers and fathers. Next slide. The way that parents talk about weight with their children plays an important role here. So, researchers have studied something called parental weight talk. And this includes critical comments that parents make about their child's weight or body size or physical appearance. And parental weight talk like this is associated with negative outcomes, particularly for girls, including emotional distress and disordered eating and harmful weight control practices. And some of our research has found that the more stigma that parents experience themselves because of their weight, the more likely they are to engage in weight talk with their kids. But we also see that parents are engaging in weight talk regardless of their weight status or weight experiences or demographic characteristics. And that in general, weight talk is a pretty common phenomenon in parent child relationships. Next slide. So I'd like to hone in on some findings of a study that we recently completed to try to better understand communication about weight by parents. And we studied two independent US samples, one of parents with children ages 10 to 17, and a separate sample of youth of the same ages of 10 to 17. And both samples reflect diversity with respect to both race, ethnicity, and weight status. Next slide. And I first want to mention in this study that weight teasing from family members was very common. So 54% of girls, 46% of boys reported weight teasing from family members. Twice as many girls as boys reported weight teasing from both family and peers. And the salience of family members was really clear in this study. We found that adolescents across both sex and weight status reported higher internalization of weight bias if they were teased about their weight from family compared to if they were teased about their weight from peers. Next slide. We also found that most parents said that they do make comments about their child's weight. And this was more frequent among mothers than fathers, but it was common across sex, race, ethnicity, and weight status. Weight comments were more frequent when youth had a BMI at or above the 95th percentile, or if they were engaged in weight management. And we also saw more frequent weight talk among Latino and white families compared to Black and African American families. We also saw that parents were making comments about weight in many different types of daily life situations, not just in person conversations, but also in digital conversations like texting. At the same time, many adolescents report that they really don't want their parents to ever talk about their weight. Next slide. And not surprisingly, negative weight-related comments from parents were associated with worse adolescent health, which included higher depressive symptoms and unhealthy weight control behaviors, whereas positive comments from parents were related to lower levels of internalized weight bias and more body appreciation in adolescence. And these patterns remained regardless of whether mothers or fathers were the source of those weight comments, and also across adolescent sociodemographic characteristics. And I think what's interesting is that we found that parents typically make both positive and negative comments about their child's weight. So these are not mutually exclusive. And we need to be focusing more on the ways in which body weight is discussed and how that contributes to different outcomes. Next slide. Now, when we looked at parent characteristics that were associated with more frequent weight talk, we found that weight-related conversations were more frequent by parents who had a lower BMI, but also among parents who themselves were engaged in weight management. And associative stigma also played a role here, meaning that parents who felt self-conscious or embarrassed about their child's weight expressed more negative weight comments to their child. And then finally, we found that parents with higher levels of internalized weight bias did make more negative weight related comments to their child, but these parents also engaged in something called positive weight socialization in their communication. And that means communicating things like respect for people of different body sizes or the importance of body acceptance. So it might be that some parents who are internalizing weight stigma are projecting those feelings of self-devaluation of weight onto their child through negative comments, whereas other parents who are internalizing weight bias may try to avoid their child engaging in that shame and instead make more positive comments about body diversity. Next slide. Finally, we found that most parents do want guidance and help on how to be more supportive of their child in talking about weight and body size. And up to 2/3 of parents in our study said that it would be useful to have resources that would help them improve their child's body image, support their child in making health behavior changes, focusing conversations more on health than weight, helping their child feel more supported about weight at home, and how to identify whether their child is being teased about weight. And we did see the highest percentage of parents who said these resources would be useful were those who did have a child engaged in weight management. Next slide. So the next step of this work is to develop resources for parents on these topics that can be disseminated and shared with parents. I'd like to mention that we do have some free educational resources to help healthcare professionals have supportive and productive conversations. This does include resources specifically for parents. These are all available and free at the Rudd Center's website. So my time is up. I will stop there, but I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about ways for families to engage in more supportive communication. And thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. And again, we will have time for Q&A at the end of both of these presentations, and you can feel free to type in your questions as we go. Now we're going to turn to our second speaker to talk about family members' comments about weight and weight bias internalization in early adolescence. Let me now introduce Dr. Catherine Roncagno.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my work with you today. My presentation today is titled Family Members' Comments About Weight and Weight Bias Internalization in Early Adolescence. Next slide. So for today's webinar, I'll be sharing findings from research that I completed as a doctoral candidate, which was recently published in Pediatric Obesity. And this work really focused on two research questions. So what is the relationship between negative familial weight talk and weight bias internalization levels in early adolescence? And secondly, does this relationship depend on gender, weight status, or race ethnicity? Next slide. So as we've already heard today, weight stigma is the societal devaluation of individuals based on their body weight, and it's driven by deeply rooted negative attitudes and stereotypes about people with a higher body weight. And it can occur across levels of society. So at the highest level, we have structural weight stigma. This would include policies and practices that limit or fail to protect opportunities, resources, and well-being of people with a higher body weight. Next slide. At the next level, we have interpersonal weight stigma. And this occurs person to person, and it's probably the stigma that you're most familiar with. And it's a lot of what Dr. Poole just shared with us now. So this would be the verbal or behavioral mistreatment of people with a higher body weight. So for example, a child who is being bullied at school because of their weight would be a form of interpersonal weight stigma. Next slide. The last level occurs at the individual level. This is sometimes referred to as intrapersonal weight stigma because it is self-directed. Dr. Poole briefly described this type of stigma, which is often termed weight bias internalization or internalized bias. And it is the self-devaluation of oneself because of their weight. So this entails endorsing negative weight-based attitudes and stereotypes and applying them to oneself, resulting in self-devaluation. So an individual would have lower levels of self-worth or self-esteem because of their body weight. So the two types of weight stigma that this research is focused on that I'm sharing with you today occurs at the interpersonal level, so person to person, and the individual level, so weight bias internalization. Next slide. So negative familial weight talk is the term that I'll use today to refer to interpersonal weight stigma that specifically comes from a family member, so mother, fathers, extended family, siblings. And this can include negative or critical comments about somebody's weight, body shape, or body size. It can, of course, include name calling or teasing, as well as judgmental comments about somebody's eating behavior or exercise habits. So, for example, a father who would encourage their child to exercise or perhaps to take up a new sport to lose weight would fall in this bucket of negative familial weight talk. Importantly, experiences of negative familial weight talk can depend on personal characteristics. So in terms of age, older children are more likely to experience negative familial weight talk than younger children. Some studies suggest differences by gender, where girls may be more likely than boys, whereas other studies find no difference. More recent studies that have included children across the spectrum of gender suggest that transgender boys and non-binary adolescents may be more likely to experience negative familial weight talk than cisgender boys, but more research is still needed in that space. In terms of weight, as you might expect, children with a higher body weight are more likely to experience negative familial weight talk than those with a lower body weight. And experiences can look different across racial ethnic groups. So studies suggest that Hispanic children are more likely to experience negative familial weight talk than non-Hispanic white or Black children. Next slide. So negative familial weight talk has long-lasting consequences to health and well-being, and Dr. Poole shared a lot of work, or rather, talked a lot about this in her presentation. So it is associated with poor mental health and physical health, such as elevated rates of anxiety or depression, poor body image, elevated stress, and fluctuations in weight. Disordered and pathological eating behaviors are among the most widely studied health-related correlates for weight stigma. This can include binge eating, dietary restriction. Other studies have also demonstrated unfavorable shifts in health behaviors, such as lower motivation to exercise or lower physical activity levels, as well as poorer sleep. Lastly, adolescence is a vulnerable developmental period when we're thinking about body image and developing long-term healthy habits. And longitudinal studies suggest that many of the adverse outcomes that are associated with weight stigma during adolescence can continue into adulthood. So this is important for adolescent health and well-being in the short term, as well as in the long term. Next slide. So some studies suggest that weight bias internalization, so that self-directed intrapersonal weight stigma, may function as the link between experienced weight stigma from family members and adverse outcomes for health and well-being. But whether and how negative familial weight talk contributes to weight bias internalization is less clear. And so the objective of the research that I'm sharing with you today was to determine the association between negative familial weight talk and weight bias internalizations in a sample of early adolescents. and to examine whether there were differences by adolescent gender, weight status, and race ethnicity. Next slide. So this study was cross-sectional analysis of baseline data from parent-child dyads that were enrolled in the SUPPER project. Now, SUPPER is an acronym for Substance Use Prevention Promoted by Eating Family Meals Regularly. This was a randomized controlled trial for parents of 5th, 6th, and 7th graders who were living in the state of Massachusetts. The study had 2 arms, one of which focused on substance use prevention and the other focused on weight stigma, but I'll only be discussing baseline data today. To be eligible, parents had to have a child in 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. They had to live with their child at least 50% of the time. Both parent and child had to be able to read, speak, or understand English or Spanish. And children who had a learning or developmental or intellectual disability that would have interfered with their independent completion of study activities or study surveys were not eligible to participate. So our primary predictor for this study was child-reported negative familial weight talk from family members that were living in the household with that child. So from mothers, fathers, siblings, or extended families such as grandparents. This measure contained 5 negative statements about weight or weight-related behavior. So for example, has your mother ever said to you that you would look better if you were thinner? Or has your father ever encouraged you to diet to lose weight? And the child would report that frequency over the past 3 months. The frequency of each family member was added together and then discretized into a 3-level ordinal variable representing negative familial weight talk having been experienced at never, occasionally, or often in the past 3 months. Our primary outcome was weight bias internalization and was captured with the modified weight bias internalization scale. This scale has been validated in adolescent and adult populations across the spectrum of weight. Children were asked to report their level of agreement with 10 statements and beliefs about themselves because of their body weight. So for example, my weight is a major way that I judge my value as a person. Their responses were then summed and averaged, and the mean score is what we used for analyses. We examined numerous variables for potential confounding and adjusted our models for the variables listed here. And to examine differences by gender, weight status, and race ethnicity, we included interaction terms in 3 separate models, which I've listed here as well. Next slide. So here we have a summary of the characteristics of our sample. So on average, adolescent participants or child participants were 12 years old. Approximately half were boys and half were non-Hispanic white. About a third had a body mass index for their age and sex at or above the 85th percentile. This corresponds with the CDC cut point of overweight or obesity. And approximately 20% had reported experiencing weight stigma from their peers at some point. In terms of parents, 73% had completed at least a bachelor's degree. Half had an annual household income greater than or equal to $150,000, and 18% reported having been born outside of the United States. Next slide. Thank you. So now we're getting into the results. I'm first going to share with you the distribution of negative familial weight talk in the sample, and then I will show you a second figure that summarizes the relationship between negative familial weight talk and weight bias internalization. So here, darker colors indicate more frequent negative familial weight talk. In our sample, 66% of adolescents reported never experiencing negative familial weight talk, 26% reported it occasionally, and 8% reported experiencing it often. Next slide. One more. Thank you. So overall, children who experienced negative familial weight talk occasionally had weight bias internalization levels that were 12% higher than children who had never experienced it. Next. And for children who had, or adolescents who had experienced negative familial weight talk often, weight bias internalization levels were 48% higher compared to children who had never experienced it. And these differences in weight bias internalization were both statistically significant. Next slide. So these next few slides are going to address whether or not this relationship depended on the adolescent's gender, weight status, or race ethnicity. Next slide. So here we have the distribution of negative familial weight talk in boys and in girls. Overall, we found that girls experienced more frequent negative familial weight talk than boys, with 31% having experienced it occasionally and 10% reported experiencing it often. Next slide. One more. Overall, boys who experienced negative familial weight talk often had weight bias internalization levels that were 32% higher than boys who had experienced it never. And for girls, weight bias internalization levels were 66% higher if they experienced negative familial weight talk often when compared to girls who had never experienced negative familial weight talk. Now, although the relative difference in weight bias internalization is nearly 2 times higher among girls when compared to boys, we did not find a difference by gender in these analyses. Next slide. So here we have our results by weight status. On the left, we have results for children with a higher body weight, and on the right for children with a lower body weight. And overall, children with a higher body weight had weight bias, experienced negative familial weight talk more frequently than those with a lower body weight. Overall, children who experienced with an elevated body weight, who experienced negative familial weight talk often, had weight bias internalization levels that were 39% higher than those with a similar body weight who had never experienced it. Similarly, children with a lower body weight, which is shown here in orange, who had experienced negative familial weight talk often, had weight bias internalization levels that were 44% higher than those with a similar body weight who had never experienced it. And here we found no difference by weight status, meaning the relationship between negative familial weight talk and weight bias internalization did not depend on the child's weight status. Next slide. So here we have our results by race ethnicity, where Hispanic children, which is that center stacked bar chart, experience slightly more frequent negative familial weight talk than children of other racial ethnic groups, where 26% of Hispanic adolescents experienced negative familial weight talk occasionally, and 14% experienced it often. Next slide. One more. So overall, our results suggest that the relationship between negative familial weight talk and weight bias internalization was only statistically significant among white non-Hispanic children. So non-Hispanic white children who experienced negative familial weight talk often had weight bias internalization levels that were 78% higher when compared to children of a similar racial ethnic group who experienced negative familial weight talk never. Next slide. So children who are Black and Hispanic experienced weight bias internalization levels were 20% higher and 25% higher respectively. However, the differences in weight bias internalization in these two groups were not statistically significant. Next slide. So in summary, among adolescents who experienced frequent negative familial weight talk, weight bias internalization levels were higher among boys and in girls, adolescents with and without a higher body weight, and among non-Hispanic white adolescents, but not Black or Hispanic adolescents. So this study was not without limitations. As a cross-sectional study, we cannot draw any conclusions about whether negative familial weight talk causes higher levels of weight bias internalization. And so longitudinal studies are needed to better understand the relationship between negative familial weight talk and internalized weight bias. There are very few longitudinal studies with children and adolescent samples that have studied internalized weight bias. And these kinds of studies are important for understanding how internalized weight bias can change or shift across the lifespan, particularly around the developmental period of adolescence and into young adulthood. Lastly, with 375 parent-child dyads, we had a fairly modest sample size that precluded inclusion of other racial ethnic groups in our interaction analyses. And so additional studies with larger and more diverse samples are needed with adequate diversity to thoroughly examine differences across different racial ethnic groups. So in conclusion, frequent exposure of negative familial weight talk was associated with higher weight bias internalization levels. Oh, next slide. And historically, research has emphasized that girls and children with a higher body weight are especially vulnerable to weight bias internalization, but our findings suggest that boys and children with a lower body weight may also be vulnerable. And I think I am at time, so I'll just wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of our speakers. And we have a number of questions already in the queue, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So let me ask about several questions that are related that came in from different attendees. One person has asked if, for specifically to begin with Dr. Poole, and then we'll go to Dr. Rancaño, but wondered if you could please expand a bit on the cultural differences that impact weight stigma from family members. And then I have a couple of follow-up questions related to specific ethnic or cultural groups. But if you could talk a little bit about that, and then as a follow-up, whether weight stigma and negative weight talk is more common in certain groups and why, perhaps. And then we can talk a little bit further about cultural and ethnic implications for these findings. So please, Dr. Poole, if you could start us off.
Sure. So there are a couple questions there. I think the second part of your question is who's more likely to experience weight stigma and internalized weight bias. And certainly we see it present across diverse groups, but there are certain groups where we see higher levels. For example, when it comes to internalized weight stigma, we typically see that this is higher in women compared to men, and typically, at least in adult populations, we see it higher in white women. But when it comes to youth, this is not a well-studied topic yet. We don't have enough research evidence to really pinpoint which groups are consistently at higher risk. Now, the question about cultural differences, I think, is really important because we know that body weight and body size have different connotations and meanings across different cultural groups. And so while we are seeing families across these different groups experience weight stigma, engage in weight talk, the nature and the impact and the experience may be different. And on top of that, we need to be thinking about the fact that the impact of stigma on health can be compounded for youth who have multiple stigmatized identities. So, for example, if they're also being stigmatized for their race or ethnicity or their sexual orientation in addition to their body weight. And, in some of the research that I presented today, we saw more frequent weight talk among Latinx parents in our study. We're not exactly sure why we saw that, but it is a little bit similar to some prior studies in this area. And, I think looking at factors like acculturation could be important to study in this context. There has been some research that has found that acculturated Mexican mothers express more concern for their child's weight than less acculturated mothers. Maybe that could affect their engagement in things like weight talk. But there could also be cultural differences in views that weight talk is maybe a way to show affection for their child. So I think, again, closer examination of some of these cultural nuances could be really informative. It's also less clear why we saw weight talk as being least frequent among Black and African American parents in our study. Some qualitative evidence has found that more Black and African American parents avoid weight talk because of either their own past experience of weight teasing and not wanting to repeat that experience for their child, or because they want their children to show respect and good manners for other people. And so again, there's a lot more that we need to better understand in terms of the motivations for engaging in this kind of communication across different groups.
And Dr. Rancaño, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Right, that was very comprehensive. But I think the only thing that I would add was, there's been some qualitative studies that have really shed some really interesting perspectives on some of the differences across cultural groups. And some of what Dr. Poole was alluding to in terms of the way that weight is discussed in different racial ethnic groups and also just across different families can look really differently. And because of that, it can be received very differently. So in some of the qualitative literature that I've read, it's a little bit older, I think in 2015, has kind of suggested that comments about weight is just viewed in a much more lighthearted manner. It's joking, it's not taken as seriously in some groups and in some racial ethnic groups. And so that could be what's happening here, where the perception of the weight comment or the weight-based teasing is just different. And perhaps that's why we're not seeing, for example, like higher levels of internalized bias in certain groups. But much more work is needed to kind of better understand what's happening, both in terms of the frequency of negative familial weight talk, but also how it's being interpreted and implications to health and well-being.
And we had also a couple of questions about specific groups such as Asian American children, mixed race children, transracial adopted children. Have there been any studies that you're aware of on those groups and any findings of note, or is that an area where research is currently needed?
Certainly from my perspective, these are groups that need much more research attention than they've received so far. I know in our own studies, oftentimes the cell sizes for the number of Asian participants, for example, hasn't been high enough to do meaningful comparisons. And what ends up happening is they get excluded from analyses. So we absolutely need more research. And this is actually a criticism of the broader weight stigma literature in general, which is that it's over relied on primarily white samples. That is starting to change. It is starting to shift. I've seen more of that shift in the adult weight stigma literature. I hope that the youth literature will start to keep up with that. But that's absolutely an area where we need more attention.
So we have several questions also about what constitutes negative versus positive weight talk. And so I want to break these apart and give an opportunity to cover several of the different facets here. But first, if you could expand a little bit on the difference between positive weight talk and negative weight talk, and perhaps mention some examples of what positive weight talk would look like and what we know about what parents can say that does have an appropriate and positive impact.
Yeah, I think we can both speak to this in slightly different ways. So from my research, which was mostly quantitative, we assessed parental comments using a modified version of what's called the Fat Talk questionnaire. And it looks at comments that parents make to their child that they're fat, that they've gained weight, that they should stop eating too much, or comparing their bodies to their peers, for example. Positive parental comments focus more on things like telling their child that their health is more important than their body size, praising their appearance. But that's also a little bit different than something I refer to called parental weight socialization. And so in our study, in addition to those positive comments, we also studied this idea of weight socialization, where we examined how often parents communicate with children in the context of promoting values of body acceptance or equality and fairness of people of different body sizes. And they were asked, how often do they make comments that people of all body size should be treated with respect, and the importance of accepting people with different body sizes, or commenting that it's unacceptable to treat people unfairly because of their body size. So there are different ways of studying this. And looking at both the adolescent perspective or youth perspective and parent perspective of what constitutes negative and positive is important in this regard. But I'll let Dr. Roncagno talk a little bit more about this in the context of her research, which is really interesting.
Thank you. So much of my work has really focused more on the negative valence of negative familial weight talk. And with the study that I shared with you today, we were looking at very clear, explicit examples of negative weight talk. So we used a 5-item measure that asked, for example, has your parent ever said that you should go on a diet? Has your parent ever told you that you would look thinner, or you would look better if you were thinner, or called you fat? So the strength, I guess, to this is that they are very explicitly negative and there's not much room for misinterpretation. Like, this is a critical comment about your weight. The downside, though, is it's very restrictive. There are a lot of different comments that a parent might make that you can experience as a negative or critical comment. So even a suggestion to eat something differently at face value can be a very neutral comment, but given your experience with that person or your personal experience and journey with weight management in general, that very neutral suggestion to eat something different can be perceived as a negative or critical comment based off of your eating behavior. As part of my dissertation, we also coded parent-child conversations. So we did a little bit of qualitative work. And this was something that came up a lot, where a parent was suggesting to their child that they should change the way that they would eat. And you could just tell, just based on the child's responses, they didn't really want to hear it. Like, this was a criticism based off of their body weight or their body shape. And so in that sense, a lot of the quantitative measures that we have might miss or undercount experiences of weight stigma, which is where these mixed methods approaches can be really, really nice for really understanding the implications and context of how negative familial weight talk is experienced.
You. And so how can we better support parents who want to discuss healthy weight, nutrition, and especially how can we better train the clinicians and pediatricians that are supporting families to also be part of the solution here with questions about healthy weight?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question because pediatricians in particular really have an opportunity to be talking to parents about these issues. And I think also to be modeling the kinds of communication that they want to see parents use. You know, one of the things that I've heard in my discussions with pediatricians is sometimes in a medical appointment with a family, the parents are expressing weight stigma toward the child in the appointment and what should they do as a clinician. And so I think this is a real, important opportunity to be, first of all, modeling respectful weight-based communication and language. I think as clinicians, we can acknowledge that parents might feel frustrated, but really educating them that critical comments can backfire, and to really talk instead about parenting strategies that can be more effective, and that goes beyond just creating a home environment where you're promoting healthy food choices, but focusing more on health rather than the number on the scale or how much weight a child needs to lose. Modeling the kinds of health behaviors that they want their children to adopt, engaging in positive weight socialization, like I talked about earlier. So, I think those are important conversations that need to happen. And there may not be many opportunities for parents to hear those messages outside a pediatrician appointment where they're having these conversations about weight-related health. And that's one of the reasons why we've tried to develop some resources on this topic. Again, we're seeing more resources for healthcare providers in the context of working with adults than working with kids, even though we see a lot of interest from pediatricians. There are some resources that have been developed. There is a knowledge conversation transition casebook that's been developed, which is kind of a practical guide to help clinicians have positive conversations about these issues with families. We've linked to a few of the existing resources that we've been able to find on the Rudd Center website. So I encourage you to take a look there. We're trying to compile as many as we can find, which are still kind of few and far between when we talk about pediatricians and opportunities for them to really integrate some of this information with parents.
And Dr. Roncaño, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Oh dear, I don't know that I deserve the last word here. This has really been the bulk of Dr. Poole's research here is developing guidelines for parents and physicians in terms of how to speak about weight. And a lot of those recommendations were really what informed a lot of my doctoral work. So really focusing a lot on the health behaviors, disentangling some of these health behaviors from only engaging in them for weight loss specifically. So I think Dr. Poole really covered the space there.
And with that, we are unfortunately out of time for today. And I'm so sorry to say that because we have a number of good questions from the audience. But if you're in the audience and you had a question that wasn't answered, please bear with us because I've got some resources for you where you may find some answers to these questions. But I want to, first of all, thank both of our speakers again so much for your insights today. This has been a fantastic and really important presentation, and there's so much more to learn here. So thank you again. Now, let me go on to a few important announcements, including where you can find out more about this topic. If you have questions about weight stigma and would like to learn more, we encourage you to check out our obesity-related policy systems and environmental research in the US, or it's also known as OPUS workshops. OPUS is a two-part series that explored lessons from successful policy systems and environmental change efforts and identified the next steps for addressing childhood obesity. It features more than 40 experts from the US and global academic institutions, global research projects, federal agencies, And the recordings from both Opus 1 and Opus 2, the webinar are available on the NCORE website, and a meeting summary of the first Opus meeting is available, and the second one will be available very soon. So please do go to the NCORE website to check that out, and you can find the link to that in the chat right now. Another couple of announcements. I would encourage all of you to sign up for our newsletter to get updates on the latest NCORE publications, tools, and resources, and upcoming events that we have planned. And so you can go to the NCORE website for that as well. And for students in our audience or those who work with students, please check out the NCORE Student Hub, which has a lot of great resources just for people who are studying the area of childhood obesity research. NCORE has a number of different tools on its website, and we know a lot of you are already using them. We would love to hear about that from you. So please let us know by sending an email to us at ncore@fhi360.org. And we may feature your work in an upcoming webinar. Please let us know how you're using our tools. And last but not least, remember to follow and like us on social media if you don't already. You can find NCORE on LinkedIn, X, and Facebook. And actually, this is the last but not least announcement for today. We'd like to hear your thoughts on today's webinar, and we encourage you to take the post-webinar survey, which is going to open up when this webinar ends. That is it for today, and so I want to say thank you again to our two fantastic speakers and to all of you in the audience for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and thank you again for being here today.